pleased to introduce Paul Henry Smith and Moldover for Beethoven and Game Music.
So Beethoven and game music, I mean, what the hell does Beethoven have to do with video game music? There's one really kind of interesting idea that he had that is right up our alley, and I'm going to show you that today. Talk about where it came from, hopefully inspire a connection between what Beethoven thought in this one spot in his music and what you've been hearing about here with things like layering and F mod and so forth. And then we'll end with Moldover taking this material and riffing on it. So I'm going to talk about theme and variation. Obviously, we all know what that is. But this concept really comes from theme and variation in that, look, we know that there's a theme, and then it's a linear form, and then there's a variation, and then there's another variation. And composers have been doing this for a long time. Some of the best pieces ever made are theme and variations. This example by Bach. The Goldberg variations. Theme followed by variation. And another variation. All sequential. So, in the theme and variations piece of music, what do the variations have in common with each other? Broadly speaking, you could say that what they have in common is they come from the same theme, but there's something even more subtle than that. And that is that there's an underlying structure that is shared with the theme and the variation. So it's not like there's variations and they came from the theme. There's something underneath both the theme and the variations that's the same. And that underlying structure is really important to creating variation. But knowing this underlying structure is also the key to creating an algorithm for generating variation. And that's a bit different. Algorithm meaning rules or some sort of process that will create variation on its own. It turns out that in 1974, someone discovered a piece of paper that was in Bach's handwriting that was a musical riddle. And if you could solve this riddle, you could generate on your own 296 more Goldberg variations that were never published. And this famous photo of, well, painting of Bach that we all know, and for hundreds of years people saw, no one realized until 1974 that this bit of music in his hand was part of that riddle. And lo and behold, in 1996, a German musicologist, Reinhold Burs, took this riddle, figured it all out, and notated all the 296 additional variations, publishing them in what we now know as the first book of Bach cheats. So you don't have to go figure it out. But it's interesting to think about that what he did was create a process by which you could get to more variations that he could have written himself but just didn't. He wanted to share with people the idea that you could think through a set of rules to get to new music, additional music. Mozart also did this. Mozart wrote an app. And it was for the hottest device at the time, the entertainment device that everyone had in their home or wanted to have in their home, the piano, yes. And the software that he wrote for it was called a musikalisches Würfelspiel. Sounds like a lot of fun. It just means musical dice game. And the way it worked was very simple. You roll the dice, and using the numbers it comes up with, in a nutshell, you get another Mozart minuet that no one had heard before, and you could play it on your piano. This is what came with the game. Across the top, these are measures, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They were like, 16 bars. And then these are the dice rolls that you could come up with. So if you rolled on for the first measure an 11, you would go look up this number 3 bit of music off the table and put it in the first bar. And if you rolled for the second one a 3, you would put snippet number 6 in bar 2, and so on until you had filled up your grid of minuet bits. This is the table that you would look up. There's our number 3 and 6 and 10. This is not to be played sequentially. This is just the material that you would put in the order. And then once you did that, you'd stick it on your piano and you can also get this in the App Store, by the way. It's called Mozart's Dice Game, and somebody actually went and did this. You can create this many Mozart minuets with it. It's 13 with 28 zeros, in case you're curious. And I read somewhere that if you took grains of sand and laid them end to end, and it's like 13 billion light years, just to give you a sense of how many Mozart minuets that are almost indistinguishable from each other you could get. Oh, what about this dude? Well, he was also very creative, but he came up with something that took this a little bit further. In order to illustrate this, I thought it might be fun to think about if Beethoven were not the super genius that we all knew he was, but was instead a dunce, what would he have done with certain material? Beethoven the dunce, if he were going to play a theme, or write a theme in variations, I thought, let me take the Second Symphony and the Scherzo movement and extract from the theme and variations that he created the underlying theme and pretend that he was going to be a lesser composer and create the sequential theme and variations that I talked about. So the theme that is actually used for that symphony, but you never hear it this way, is this. Okay, and then variation number 1 would be some French horns. Variation 2 would be, let's say, loud theme in the cellos and basses, and then some chords on top of that. Okay, what could you do with this material instead of putting it in a sequential format like this? Well, you could put them into layers, simultaneously existing layers, that kind of, well, I guess the idea is the underlying structure of the theme and the variations, if you include the tempo as part of the underlying structure, not just the theme and the rhythm and the harmony, but also the tempo or the speed of it. That allows you to conceive of them as all sort of simultaneously existing in some bizarre parallel universe where every variation is playing at every moment, at every time. This kind of layering concept, which is so important in thinking about game music. Beethoven, I think, thought this way, and that's what genius Beethoven did. So I just call this idea simultaneous variation. I think it could really be an interesting part of gameplay, rather than thinking of whether you're accessing a certain level of a sound or layer of a sound as driven by conditions in the game. It might be inspiring to think about music already having this character built into it and how it might relate to the game in a different way, where conditional triggers or other elements that are part of what technically can drive this also generate musical variation. And if you're going to think this way, obviously having a continuous tempo or steady tempo will work best in tools like Wise and Fmod. I think if Beethoven were alive today, he would certainly be using these kinds of things. Because then he didn't, what he did for the Second Symphony is he had to write it down and pass it out to an orchestra. And, we don't have him here, obviously. However, we have the second best thing, master of controllerism and the art of performing a controller. We have Moldover with his wonderful mojo, who's going to create performance of Beethoven's Second Symphony Scherzo that no one's ever heard before, using the material Beethoven created himself. Let's welcome Moldover.